Hi, I'm Lisa Kudrow. I'm glad you're here today. Mental health care and education is important to me. That's why I chose to become involved at UCLA, joining the Resnick Neuropsychiatric Hospital Board of Advisors and emceeing the galas and #WOW, the Wonder of Women Summit. I'm so excited that WOW and UCLA's Friends of Semel Institute Open Mind have joined together to bring outstanding, free virtual programs about mental health issues. This means you will hear conversations on the intersection of culture and science between renowned authors and filmmakers who share their personal stories and world-class UCLA scientists that highlight the latest in mental health research, care, and progress. I'm thrilled to welcome you to our Open Mind WOW series and hope to see you at many more programs.
Hi, I'm Wendy Kelman, and I too would like to welcome you to today's Open Mind program, sponsored by UCLA's Friends of the Semel Institute, the Resnick Neuropsychiatric Hospital Board of Advisors, and #WOW, the Wonder of Women. We are thrilled that you are here, and we hope that you find today's Open Mind program on Black mental health informative and inspiring. Thank you to Lisa Kudrow for her warm welcome and for her dedication to mental health education, research, and clinical care at UCLA. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, the Open Mind is our educational series that brings together thought leaders in science and culture to present free programs about mental health issues. In addition to supporting the Open Mind, the Friends of Semel also awards yearly research grants to early career neuroscientists. And we just launched our Open Mind Film Festival for high school students in Los Angeles County. You can learn more about all of these programs on our website, friendsofthesemelinstitute.org. We are honored to have with us today Dr. Rheeda Walker, author of the critically acclaimed new book, The Unapologetic Guide to Black Mental Health. Dr. Walker is a professor of psychology at the University of Houston. Her research explores Black mental health in today's world and emphasizes two understudied areas: suicide science and African American adult mental health. We are also honored to welcome back to the Open Mind Dr. Gail Wyatt, professor of psychiatry and biobehavioral sciences at UCLA. Dr. Wyatt, who has spoken at previous programs, including our two #WOW Wonder of Women summits, will join Dr. Walker in conversation. Dr. Wyatt is the director for the UCLA Sexual Health Program, Director, Center for Culture, Trauma, and Mental Health Disparities, co-director of the HIV/AIDS Substance Abuse and Trauma Training Program, co-director, South Africa Center for Chronic Mental Health Disorders, and co-director, Behavioral Approaches to Reduce Effects of Trauma on Mental and Physical Health and Cognitions. She is the author of numerous books, including No More Clueless Sex, which we featured at a special Open Mind salon. A few housekeeping notes. Today's presentation is being recorded and will be ready for viewing tomorrow on our website. There you will also find videos from other past Open Mind programs, along with a calendar of upcoming events. Everyone's Zoom has been automatically set to mute, and we ask that it remain muted throughout the program. Our program will run for approximately 1 hour, with the last 15 minutes reserved for your questions. Please be sure to type them into the Q&A located at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will do our very best to get to as many questions as possible. And finally, in the spirit of seasonal giving, if you feel that our Open Mind programs are of benefit to you and provide a valuable free service to the public, much like NPR or public television, we hope you will place the Friends of Semel at the top of your list. A donation link can be found on our website, or to make it even easier, you can join our community of supporters by clicking on the link you will receive in our thank you email tomorrow. Please know that every dollar matters, and no donation is too small or too large. Now, please join me in giving a warm Zoom welcome to Dr. Rheeda Walker and Dr. Gail Wyatt.
Good evening.
Good evening. It's good to see you.
It's good to see you. It's good to be here.
Yes.
And many thanks to Wendy for that warm welcome and introduction on behalf of the Simmel Institute.
I agree. Thank you, Wendy, for always making me feel welcome. Well, Rheeda, we'd like to hear more about your book.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about the book. And, you know, one thing that I think would be helpful, and that is to talk a little bit more about just who I am beyond being a scholar, a clinical psychologist, a professor, researcher. And I think it's important in part because in the tradition of many of our well-known theorists in psychology, everyone had their own story and they brought their lived experience to developing theories. And I'm no different, to be honest. I grew up in Savannah, Georgia, very beautiful Savannah, Georgia, in a predominantly African-American community. So my street was all Black. And I attended church and was active in a church that was predominantly African-American. And, you know, played with cousins and friends, not just in Savannah, but also in rural South Carolina. And even my classrooms, at times I was bused to different schools, but oftentimes my classrooms sometimes, you know, were mixed race, but sometimes the classes were all Black. And that was my reality and that was my experience. And our parents oftentimes told us that we would have to work twice as hard to get half as far.
Yes.
And we learned that as important for how you be successful. Neither one of my parents went to college, but they were certain to instill in us that there were things that we had to navigate as Black children growing up to be Black women in the society, and things that we had to be cognizant of that I think it's not just me, you know, and it wasn't just us. There are so many, and I see you nodding your head because you know so many of these stories.
Yes.
That while they get passed on as ways to survive, it infiltrates our very psychology of who we are as Black people. And I got to a space where I needed to talk more about, you know, how we integrate survival into our day-to-day psychology, and how in some ways, you know, it's good and it represents strength, but in other ways it can be problematic. And I needed for us to be able to have everyday kinds of conversations about those realities.
Well, we're fascinated by what you've done.
Thank you.
So would you like me to ask you a few questions then? Or would you like to just tell us a little bit about it in your own words?
Sure, well, we can start with questions and I'll be sure to freestyle and add in what I think could be helpful.
Okay. Well, you know, we are in a department of psychiatry at UCLA. It's very diverse and it has many, many areas of specialization. So this is really a thrill to have an opportunity to talk about Black mental health. And I'm personally thrilled that the women of the Simmel asked me to speak with you. It's very, very rare when two Black women get an opportunity to speak, even in front of everybody else. That doesn't matter. The whole issue is, what kind of dialogue can we have? That's the most important thing, isn't it? So, you
Absolutely.
know, I'm a Texan too. I was born in Fort Worth. So we have that to share, as well as clinical psychology, and I'm sure a host of many other things. But I really want the audience to be able to appreciate what it's been like for you as a Black woman to write a book about Black mental health.
You know, it's interesting because the book that I wrote isn't exactly the book that I set out to write. And I think some of that is in my humility and understanding that there is so much that we don't know. And so my plan was to talk about, racism and, the problems of racism and discrimination and how that affects, the psychology of Black people and increasing suicide rates, suicide death rates
Yes.
for Black men, women, and children. And so I thought, okay, I'll let people know that there's a problem and then they'll figure out how to address it.
Right.
Well, my writing coach said, well, no, you have to tell people what to do. We have to help people actually fix the problem. But for me, I was thinking, well, there's so much we don't know about how to fix the problems, and especially with regard to racism that happens externally. So racism isn't a problem of Black people. Racism is a problem in our society. And so how am I going to tell folks to deal with something that isn't our fault or our responsibility? So that was something that I grappled with in the book, and recognizing that in the end, it felt like a big responsibility, that I had a huge responsibility. And I know I stand on the shoulders of so many great scholars, including you, including that of
Thank
Naeem Akbar. Dr. Akbar wrote
you.
the foreword for the book. And so I was thinking, okay, there's some brilliance that's going to land on me at some point, in writing the book. So I saw it as a big responsibility, but I think that I've been up for the task.
Oh, you've very much been up for the task. And I think modeled for a lot of women that we have our own story to tell, and only we can tell it. I think the narrative and the dialogue has always been from some other group telling or describing who we were. And I think that now is the time to clarify all of that. So what brought you to an unapologetic book?
Well, just like you were literally just saying,
Uh-huh.
that other folks have been telling our story, and in telling it in a way that misses a lot of important points. So I needed to be able to not have Black people get sidelined in this story.
Yes.
So I had to unapologetically talk about our realities, not as underserved people, or, a part of a multicultural group, or my favorite as minorities. I needed to be able to talk about, Black people holistically, who do have a lot of strengths and have a lot of resilience. And that's why we're here. But I needed to not talk about, the labels that have nothing to do really with what it means to be a person of African descent in the US and technically
Yes.
around the world, really. So I needed to do that part. But then the other part was that I had to tackle some of the things that I see as kind of self-inflicted challenges. So there's a lot of stigma, as you know, related to mental health in the community, like extra stigma.
Yes.
And sometimes what that looks like is an over-reliance, I think, on spirituality and religiosity. And I say that as a person of tremendous faith. But I also know, and I know you've also heard these stories, many have, where someone is struggling, they go to someone, African-American in the Black community, and they say, I'm really just having a tough time, and maybe I need to talk to somebody. And they say, well, pray about it. Okay, well, I don't want prayer to be the only thing that we do. We might pray about cancer or pray about heart disease, but we also go and see a physician. So, so we have to do much more than some of the things that we've always done. And I've gotten feedback from some pastors and clergy that I was hard on the church. And I thought, really? Okay, well, I guess that's the part of the book that's unapologetic, because we need to have some serious conversations in the community.
I think so too. And I think that everyone needs to be ready for the truth, because there's just so much misinformation out there. It's time to really clarify where spirituality plays a role, but also what role do we play in our own health and in our own healing? Yeah. So tell me, go ahead.
I was just thinking how, I really just don't want to diminish in any way the reality that there is a lot of fear and concern and mistrust in talking to a professional. Right. And, on the one hand, we'll hear people say things like, well, I don't want to go tell them all my business. And I get that, there is a lot of not misplaced mistrust in the community. And so presumably talking to a pastor or talking to someone, who can pray, offer intercessory prayer on that person's behalf. Like, I absolutely get, the importance of that and the value of that. But there also comes a time when we have to figure out, and that's why I talk about this also in the book, if you need to see a professional, these are some things that you might want to consider and think about. And we have to look for our mental health professional like we look for our hairstylist, because
right.
it's that important.
And the relationship that's built between you and that person is very important.
Yes.
Yes. Tell me about psychological fortitude.
One of the things that I always tell doctoral students that I supervise, and that's something I've been doing for years, for folks who are in the audience who may not know about our graduate training programs, is that our students actually have to see clients as part of working on their doctoral degree. So I have for years supervised doctoral students who are working on their degrees. And one of the things that I will always say is that you have to meet your client where they are. You can't stand on one side of the street and your client's on the other side of the street, more metaphorically speaking, and say, hey, come on over here, do better. It doesn't work that way. You literally have to go to them where they are. And I am clear that part of the challenge of talking about mental health in our community is the label of mental health.
Yes.
People hear mental and they automatically defer or default to crazy or weakness or something's wrong with you. And for some reason, Black people don't seem to deserve mental health. That's for other folks. That's not for us. And rather than me trying to say like, oh, okay, well, it's okay to talk about mental health, I said, well, I just need to completely flip this script. And that's where this notion of psychological fortitude came from, that I introduced specifically for the book. I did not want to put mental health even in the title of the book. The publisher insisted because they said, well, people won't find it. And I said, well, people won't be looking for it. That's why we need to disguise it as something else.
Right.
So psychological fortitude is this idea or notion of whatever it takes on a 0 to 10 rating, being able to assess individually, what is my ability to be able to manage my emotions, to be able to take care of my family, to be able to go to school, pass classes, and go to work and function, and also withstand the threats to all of those things. We've heard too many stories of someone being out exercising or engaging in some leisure activity who's a Black person who is threatened or who otherwise doesn't make it home. And Black people are constantly navigating how to be successful at work and how to be able to go to school and not, or someone's child to be able to go to school without getting different discipline than another child. For me, like I said, having to work twice as hard to get half as far, like that is a lot of weight. And so we need to be able to assess not just our ability to be able to do the things that we're put on this planet to do, because I do believe everyone has a calling, has a purpose. Like, what is that thing? But still navigate, driving home at night and learning how to survive the encounter. What is the 0 to 10 rating of the ability to do all those things? So psychological fortitude is the 0 to 10 rating of being able to live your life. So oftentimes, we'll ask someone like, hey, how are you doing? And they'll say, fine, or I'm doing all right. It doesn't really tell us much. But if you say, on a 0 to 10, what's your PF? So PF is short for psychological fortitude. Where's your PF today? I had a friend ask me the other day, I didn't sound so good. And so she said, where's your PF? And at the time it was at a 5. That says a lot more, like as a numerical value, than I'm fine. So PF I introduced to give us a new way to talk about basically the things that matter, but with a 0 to 10 rating that gives us a little bit more information than I'm okay, I'm all right, I'm fine.
That's really interesting. And I think it's really helpful. It's a part of self-care. You're really monitoring how you're feeling. But since we're training therapists in this setting in the Department of Psychiatry, suppose you think you're at a 5, but everybody else sees you as a 1. What should happen?
Well, one thing that I advise is that
Mhm,
anywhere under a 6 means that something needs to happen.
mhm,
And I appreciate what you said about, this self-assessment. And, as clinicians, we know that you don't really do anything until you know what's going on.
mhm,
And so we have to assess and get some sense of, are they doing okay? They're not okay? Anything below a 6. And let me say this. So ideally, we'd have psychological fortitude of 10. We're in the middle of a global pandemic. So I wouldn't really expect anyone to be functioning at a 10. And
mhm.
if they are, please let me know what you're doing because I'd like,
It's your secret,
but
huh?
I need to know the secret.
Mhm,
But if anyone is falling below, 6, then that
mhm.
means something needs to happen. So the
Yes.
something could be getting professional help, or the
Mhm,
something could be, revisiting a time in their life when they were at 7 or 8 or higher and evaluating, what's the difference now for me,
mhm,
for
mhm,
now compared to then?
mhm,
What was
mhm,
that?
mhm,
Ideally, most people are at 7 or
mhm,
higher.
mhm,
But then a 6 is also different from a 2. So if someone's at a 2, then they probably do need to be thinking about professional help. And
mhm.
I'm always fascinated when people ask, well, do you think I need professional help? My thinking is that if you have to ask,
You probably do.
you probably do. And what a
Yeah.
lot of people don't realize is that an
Mhm.
immensely important part of our training is assessment. So if you think you need help, then seek help from a professional so that they can evaluate what they think is going on and
Right,
then let the person know how they can be helpful.
right. That makes perfect sense. Shall we try some of these questions? You ready?
Yeah, I thought we were doing questions.
No, those were my questions. So here's one from Gabriella. Great start to the conversation, Dr. Walker. Having conversations about who we are and how we are grounded in survival as women of color. Thank you for your work. Well, that was just a lovely compliment. Okay, here's another one though from Jordan. What advice would you give to Black and Brown LGBTQ folks who live at the intersection of two minorities? I grew up in the conversation south of Baton Rouge, and I would love some advice on how I could break the chains of my childhood stigmas now in adulthood. That's a great question, Jordan.
It is a great question. And one of the things that I talk about in the book is the importance of authenticity.
Mm-hmm.
And the challenge for individuals who are living at the intersection of two marginalized groups is navigating being oneself and the potential consequences of other
Mm-hmm.
people not valuing,
Mm-hmm.
the whole person. And that's so incredibly important and not anything to be minimized. And I think that, finding people who are allies. So sometimes we want for people to just change and be who we need them to be. And it just doesn't work out that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
In the meantime, find people who aren't so judgmental. We are
Mm-hmm.
incredibly judgy as a
Mm-hmm.
society, but
Mm-hmm.
for anyone who feels like they can't be themselves, then they have to find, the peers, the aunties, whoever is willing to accept you for who you are and
Mm-hmm.
hang on to that person.
And start there. Yeah.
Start there. Absolutely
Uh-huh.
start there.
Mhm. I think it's really important for people to realize that we're born in a family, but we can also create a family of our own with
Yeah.
supportive people who can help you make that next step. And that step may be going to really find more about what happened in childhood that may need to be discussed and really separated from. That's a great question. Okay, here's another one. You ready?
Yes.
This is from America. With the brutal murders of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and Ahmaud Arbery, there's been a racial reckoning, and racism has finally been centered as a public health issue and crisis and documented as bad for health. Shouldn't clinicians start systematically assessing for everyday discrimination and perceived discrimination? Wow, that's a good one.
It is. And the short answer is absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And I talk in the book about just the idea that racism honestly has been here for so very long. And as clinicians, one of the things that we know is that the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior.
Mm-hmm.
There seems to be a racial reckoning, but it's moving at a glacial pace.
Mm-hmm.
And I do hope that, you know, the scholars and the academics and professionals who are listening will begin to think more intentionally about training.
Mm-hmm.
I certainly do that, you know, when we have a therapist who may be white or European American and they have a client who's African American, who's racial or ethnically different.
Mm-hmm.
They have to first have that conversation, you know, about what it's like to be in the room with someone who's different, so that that person knows it's okay to talk about race and racism.
Right.
These conversations have to happen because, and one of the things that I have found in my work is that I think oftentimes we try to assume that racism is just another stressor.
Mm-hmm.
So scholars and clinicians think, well, you know, that's just one of many things that Black folks deal with. But in my own research, I found that racism contributes to depression and anxiety after we've accounted for all those other
Oh,
stressors.
absolutely. Absolutely. It can literally make you sick.
It is.
Mm-hmm.
And Sierra Carter at Emory, you know, talked
Mm-hmm.
about this. There was an article that came out in The Guardian. I don't know if you've had a chance to see it, that talks about
No.
how
Mm-hmm.
racism, and we've had some research over the years, we've known,
Mm-hmm.
but
Mm-hmm.
continually, you know, the science is showing us, you know, even more with even more advanced methods, how racism is literally killing us. It is literally.
Absolutely. And my team was one of the first to identify racism and discrimination as a trauma, as a form of trauma. And that's amazing. After hundreds of years of these experiences, we're finally just finding a way to talk about them. And people have been living it all this time. It's stunning to see how poorly trained we are to deal with the things that affect us every day. So
Yeah.
just so glad you're here so that we can talk about these issues today. Here's another great question from Andrea. Please address the racism of being high-toned. Within Black families, there is differential treatment by skin color. Please address the genetics of African Americans that have white plantation owner blood. Americans are not Black like Kenyans and Nigerians. Is there cognitive dissonance within African Americans?
Andrea, that sounds like a dissertation type question.
That's a deep one, isn't it?
It is. And, you know, I can start by acknowledging some of the work that's been done by IO psychologists and others, you know, just with regard to the impact, because some people would deny it, you know, the impact of complexion and outcomes. And social psychologists have done this work also, that people who have darker complexion serve longer prison sentences. This is real, you know, are less likely to get calls for you know, housing, for apartments, for jobs, you name it. So that's something that happens externally, but I actually realized that the question was also about, you know, what happens within families.
Yes.
And, you know, I mean, it is real. And I know that I, as a child, was advised not to play outside in the sun for too long. And it's just what we do. And that's why it's important for us to have these kinds of conversations with regard to how it is rooted also in racism. So we learn racism just like everybody else learns racism. And we have to be intentional about saying, I'm not going to participate in that. I'm not going to talk about how so-and-so has good hair and how the other so-and-so in the family doesn't. Just stop it, because it does have a negative impact, you know, that can be carried from one generation to the next and can start to affect self-esteem. And I don't think that families want to impact, you know, young children's self-esteem, but we have to realize that it does have a negative effect.
So what would you tell a parent? What would you tell a parent of little people, little children? What should they be saying? Andrea needs to know.
Well, Andrea, I'm pretty sure that Andrea isn't commenting on any child's complexion, but she may have family members who have. And it's okay to say to them that that's not okay. You know, on the one hand, I think that what happens is sort of how we diminish family members who have a darker skin complexion, but even those who have a fair complexion can be teased And I think I didn't necessarily follow, but I think she was talking about higher or lighter complexion and fairer
Yes, I think so too.
that in our society, it's valued more.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
but within families, someone could feel like they don't quite fit in or they aren't valued as much within the family because they have a lighter complexion. And what does that mean
Mhm.
about them?
Mhm.
And so if she ever hears it, I know it's certainly something that I do, that if I've ever heard it, it's been a while, or maybe no one says it around me. But if
Mhm.
I ever hear it, I call that out and talk
Mhm.
about, what do you really mean when you say
Mhm.
that? And do you know that that can
Mhm.
have adverse consequences for how a child sees him or herself or how they see themselves? And is
Mhm.
that what you want? Because if it's not, then stop.
Well, what would we say to someone who wants to know more about the genetics of skin color?
That might be above my pay grade.
Oh no, nothing's above your pay grade. We know now that we're almost 99% just like someone else who may be of a very different skin color, even white. And that's been a hard reckoning for so many people because they have used skin color as a way of trying to organize and put people in a hierarchy of bad versus good, always the dark being bad, always the closer to white being good. And that really has no merit, it has no scientific basis. And it's really kind of pulled the rug out of so many people's argument about genetically different people, genetically better, more intelligent. We've been trained to expect that if you're fairer skin, you do better on IQ tests. There is absolutely no basis for that except how people treat you, what they may teach you because of your skin color, but there's nothing coming out of your head or your genetics that should lead to that. So I think we need to set the record straight on some of these old myths that really need to die now, at least with this conversation, that people need to be clear that that kind of thinking needs to be talked about in order to educate everybody who has that kind of misconception. Right. Yeah.
Absolutely. We used race or we used genetics and saying, someone was genetically inferior
Mm-hmm.
as
Mm-hmm.
reasons to separate races.
Mm-hmm.
And even more
Yes.
so, going further or going another further, as my granny used to say, to say that these individuals aren't human.
Mm-hmm.
There's absolutely no genetic or scientific basis, as Dr.
Right.
Wyatt was saying, for that
Mm-hmm.
whatsoever. And it's
Mm-hmm.
rooted really in racism. But you know what?
Yes.
I'll actually share with you. There was a study that was done some years ago because there was evidence that if you look at the brain circumference of Black people, then it was smaller than the brain
Mm-hmm.
circumference of white
Mm-hmm.
people. And so that suggested that white people were superior because of brain
Right.
circumference. But there
Mm-hmm.
was a study that was done that was a secondary analysis of a larger data set that actually found that Black women had a larger brain circumference than white women.
Mm-hmm.
So what does that mean?
Right.
And so we have to be really very clear. And that is honestly one of my frustrations about the discipline of psychology,
Mm-hmm.
psychiatry, is
Mm-hmm.
that some of the science has been used
Oh
to
yes.
justify
Mm-hmm.
racism. And
Yes.
it's tragic. We
Mm-hmm.
have to have those conversations. If anyone is curious, pick up a copy of Even the Rat Was White by
Mm-hmm.
Bob Guthrie
Mm-hmm.
and look at some of the science in there.
Mm-hmm. I think we're trying to set the record straight on what psychology really should be about, Rita. Much more than what it was when we were little, for sure.
For
Let's
sure.
try another good question. Here's one from Karen. Could you please talk about the differences between psychological fortitude and stoicism?
Well, I think the emphasis for psychological fortitude is, and
Mm-hmm.
I think it's balanced in a way so that we can focus more so on finding an opportunity for strengths,
Mm-hmm.
finding a way to get to that place where we're achieving our life goals. And I'll talk also about mental health because it was born out of this notion that mental health is about crazy. And maybe some people think that only certain people get to be psychologically well.
Mm-hmm.
Each one of us deserves to be psychologically intact, to be honest, in order
Mm-hmm.
to do the things that we need to do. Now, yes, there are some people who, as an example, may, hear voices or who experience bipolar disorder that has to be managed, and those individuals have a different level of psychological challenge. But there are others of us who seem healthy, but really need to be making different kinds of decisions for our lives. And I think about even now, again, being in the middle of this pandemic, and people seem to be working actually 3 times as hard, going
Oh,
to more
yes.
Zoom meetings. I've seen people talk about being in 2 or 3 different meetings at the same
Same time.
time.
Yeah.
We never did that pre-pandemic. And, we really have to be much more intentional. And maybe that's one part of psychological fortitude, is having the intentionality about living our best selves rather than, necessarily retreating, from being intentional or from having the best psychological well-being possible.
I think you're right. And I think Stoicism was something described very early amongst slaves who could take any kind of punishment, any kind of separation, uh, and just stand and be calm as if it didn't really bother them. Actually, we don't know what was going on inside of them. We don't know about their heart. We don't know about any of the other biological markers that we can actually measure now. But we know that sometimes when people don't register an emotion, actually, they can be highly stressed and quite emotional. They have just really separated themselves from those visible demonstrations of emotion and probably need to be reconnected by someone who can talk with them professionally and help them understand, why can't you cry? Or why can't you be sad or talk about it? Or even sadly, why can't you be happy? And so, there are a lot of people who just don't express emotion.
And I think it's something that's been learned over time. And it's been
Mhm.
learned through just basic survival.
Mhm.
And we got to get beyond, if we can, and that's part of my hope, is getting beyond basic survival. But actually, part of what prompted me to write the book was recognizing that the suicide death rates were going up, especially for young children, Black
Yes.
children, age 5 to 11.
Mhm.
And I wondered about, well, what's going on with the parents? Because I'm clear, I'm not a child psychologist. I know many really very impressive scholars who are child psychologists. My emphasis was more so on the adults and the parents, and how are they
Mhm.
doing?
Mhm.
What do they need to be doing differently, and recognizing that they could be so tuned out that they don't know what's going on for the
Mhm.
children. And again, getting back to a place of being intentional and
Mhm.
saying, okay, I'm not doing okay if I'm honest with myself. And that's part of that authenticity regarding the other question. If I'm honest with myself, how am I doing? And
Mhm.
what are the next steps that I need to take, rather than letting life just happen to me and hope for the best?
Yes. But I think this discussion that we're having is one that a lot of people in training need to have too. Because many times I don't think they really understand how to interpret the behavior of little Black boys or little girls or parents, because they come in, and particularly in settings that are mostly white, very stoic. And it's really difficult to get a sense of what's really bothering people, because they're trying to behave in very calm and reserved ways when actually they're crying and screaming inside, but afraid to be that way because of all the stereotypes about Black people in a mental health setting.
Yeah.
So we really need to make people comfortable, but we also need to train our professionals to be able to understand the range and the limitations that have been placed on us over these 401 years. Yeah. It's really quite an education to have.
Yeah.
I've got a good question here. This one has to do with culture. How do you address the topic of cultural disconnect in the workforce for your peers who are struggling to understand the concept?
Yeah,
Cultural disconnect.
that's another fun one, because I think, we have to pay attention to the source of the disconnect.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure every individual is different, but one thing that I do know, that for a lot of times, life for Black folks is about survival.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, part of survival has been doing whatever you can to approximate whiteness. And so what that looks like is, some kids might get teased for acting white,
Mm-hmm.
and talking certain ways,
Mm-hmm.
and shunning the things that seem stereotypically Black,
Mm-hmm.
in an interest, or in the interest of surviving.
Yes.
And so, and families sometimes will move out to the suburbs, so that their children can go to the best schools and, and get the best education in order to, fit into our mainstream society. The challenge of that, and this is what I talk about in the book, is connecting with what it means, not even necessarily to be Black, but what it means to be of African descent.
Yes.
Because culture comes from, or at least for Black folks, the culture from generation to generation, started with being African people, primarily West African. And I truly believe that the strong sense of spirituality that came from being West African people is part of what has buffered us from insidious racism over generations. We talk about like Black girl magic and Black boy joy. I'm like, that's African. That is in our talk about DNA. That is
right.
in who we are and what has given us the ability to be able to survive. But I do think that, trying to walk this tightrope between being Black, but not too Black, in order to be able to survive. And how I do believe it's created tremendous stress and strain for some Black people. And I think the first step is to recognize that, I mean, this society is kind of insane, to be honest, and that's a technical term. Being called upon to not be who you are in order to survive.
Yes, it's quite a challenge when you read about young Black men being shot and killed because they're waving something that ends up being a sandwich. Or in a state where there's gun carrying permission to have a gun and being killed before people realize, well, they had a card. The same kinds of assumptions are not made when it comes to Black people. We don't get the benefit of the doubt. And it's so important for young people and adults to know how to code switch. You know about that, Rheeda? Because I think
a little bit.
It's describing it, just the whole ability to know what behaviors are acceptable in what setting. And in therapy, this is so important to be able to talk about with your clients.
Yeah, and I think also recognizing, and I'll say more about, what that code switching looks like, but recognizing that it's happening. So there are some who would turn off, what it means to be Black, and they just say like, oh no, that's just not for me. I'm just American. I'll never forget, one of my students in the Black psychology course some years ago said, well, Dr. Walker, why are we talking about Africa? I'm just American. And he was a Black man.
Really?
Yes. And the challenge was that he didn't realize, he didn't have an understanding of the parts of himself and his identity that were African, because he didn't have the label or the language to talk about what made him African, to talk about the importance of, it's not just about me, but it's about my family and my community and how that was a part of who he was. And I knew it because he talked about his family and some of the decisions he had made as a college student because of his family. Interestingly, though, like with regard to code switching, it was actually that same class. They were a fascinating group, and I talked about how you have to, you talk a certain way depending on who your audience is. And so for me, I'll talk pretty differently at a faculty meeting than I will at the family reunion.
Right.
So a student said, and a white male student said, well, Dr. Walker, that's the same as me talking different with my grandmother than I do with my friends. And I said, I'll tell you the key difference. And the key difference is that you don't have the kinds of consequences that a Black person would have not having the ability to talk at the boardroom, the way they're able to do and to fit in. There could be consequences of not even getting hired in the first place and not being able to talk a certain way at the interview, or not getting a promotion if you show up communicating in a certain way. Or, if your hair is too suspicious looking, I wear my hair curly, but I didn't always do that. I used to have a flat iron and keep it straight so that I could fit in as much as possible. And so the changes that he made talking to his grandmother was nothing like the kinds of ways that Black people contort themselves to fit into mainstream society.
Yes. And people in training don't understand the importance of code switching. It can be an element of survival. If you wear the wrong clothes, it can portray a statement about you. Or if you've got a hat on or you don't. There are just so many pieces of it. But I think what troubles me as a professor training and mentoring people in this system, in this hospital system and mental health clinic, is that we don't have the kind of training that we need to inform the trainees who come in, Black or white, Asian or Latino. It doesn't matter. None of us know enough about each other to really be able to inform a training program. And we really got to take this on. If we're going to be able to see everybody, we've got to know something about it. And you mentioned history too, as being very critical, that young man talking to his grandmother. If you don't know your history and you don't know that you're not just just American, you really need to read. That's just a basic. And I think that's where it really has to start. You've got to be informed about other people and their history and what they've been through, and not just make assumptions that what you see on TV or you hear in the media really tells the whole story. If you really want to know the mystery, you've got to find it and read it.
Yes. Well, and sometimes, parents have to be diligent, parents of K through 12 children.
Mm-hmm.
And, being in Texas, I had a chance to look at the social studies textbook. And there was some national criticism some years ago, where they called the enslaved people workers, highly suspicious.
Mm-hmm.
Parents have to be careful about what their children are learning in school so they can, supplement that education.
Yes. Yes.
Calling enslaved people who were snatched from their homes, workers,
Mm-hmm.
like that's
Mm-hmm.
beyond misleading.
Mm-hmm.
And so then those individuals grow up to be people who are wondering, well, what the big deal is about racism. And that is
Mm-hmm.
sad, to be honest. It
Mm-hmm.
really is just sad.
It's sad. The story is so much more than that. And I don't think we'll ever know enough about history. It's revealed to me all the time by just talking to people, a little bit more about my family with each conversation. Here's another great question. What do you think the way certain people grew up affects the way they view their mental health? Oh, Miguel asked that question.
Yes, well, Miguel probably knows, that when you learn in your family that we don't talk about certain things,
Mm-hmm.
we don't talk about being depressed.
Mm-hmm.
If you're Black or you're Asian or Latino, you don't get to talk about depression. It's not a thing.
Mm-hmm.
That's for other people.
Mm-hmm.
And, because of that, we have these narratives that we internalize that is, we don't get to talk about when we're feeling so down, we don't want to get out of bed, or when we're feeling incredibly empty and we don't care about life.
Mm-hmm.
That's where we first learn how we see the world is at home and with our families.
Mm-hmm.
And so I know some people who, once they leave home, they figure out there's a whole world out there. But
Yes.
I'm glad Miguel's here for this conversation.
Are you saying that in many families they're not to talk about their mental health problems to professionals? And many times that's a real problem when they come into therapy?
Yeah, or to anyone outside of the home,
Mm-hmm.
what
Mm-hmm.
goes on in this house
Mm-hmm.
stays in this
in the
house.
house. Yeah.
And so if someone is struggling, they know for a fact they can't talk to anyone in the house, which is interesting. So it's like what's going on in the house stays in the house, but the people in the house can't talk about what's going on in the house.
Mm-hmm.
It really is, it's fascinating. It really is. But I do believe that a lot of it is still about survival.
Yes.
If people outside found out that we had some weakness or something was wrong, we were defective, hey, but good grief, if someone has, type 2 diabetes, or if they have a broken leg, they get help. And somehow we sideline our minds as if it's, it'll work itself out. And the reality is that, when we start to see challenges, we start to see trouble, we can offset some of the consequences quicker the sooner that we get the help we need.
I think so too. There are so many questions and we have so little time. I'm going to try to get through a couple more. This is from Kawina. How do we challenge the idea that we have to be 10 times better than our counterparts to succeed? I think that while this is true in some instances, it creates an unrealistic expectation and exacerbates our stress. Wow. You talk about stress, I just can feel that from hearing my mother say, you have to be twice as good as everybody else if you expect to get an A. What do you think about that?
You know, it's funny because there's a part of me that says, well, it's true.
I think it's true.
I think we have enough data to support it. At the same time, it is absolutely a burden and it's absolutely stressful. And that's why I talk about, in the book, just intentionality. And so as an example, and I had this conversation, at some point, I've actually had this conversation multiple times. A lot of my students are African-American or otherwise identify with a racial ethnic minority group. And they're trying to figure out how they can both do the work that drove them to go to grad school, which typically is related to, understanding mental health for people who tend to be not part of the mainstream conversation. At the same time, there's little reinforcement, as you know, for doing that work. And so you almost, inherently have to work twice as hard to make your work seem like something that people care about. Like that is hard work. And having to shift who you are, shift who your work is, or just say, well, I'm not going to be able to get that published, so I just won't do it. And that doesn't feel good. And so you have to make decisions, okay, on this occasion, am I going to do something that is going to stress me out so that I can get to the next stage? Or am I going to say, no, I'm not, and I'm going to have to figure it out another way? So I think the answer to the question is recognizing that it is a reality that sometimes you do have to, in fact, work harder, and you got to work harder while being isolated. So you're the only one trying to get to the next stage. So the people around you, at work, they don't get it. And the people at home are like, why are you still in college? And so there are so many different levels, but I do believe that someone might say, you know what, I'm going to put in the 10 times over here. But if my PF is teetering at 6.5, so I'm not going to put it in over there so that I can kind of at least sustain a little bit. It's a tightrope.
So what I'm hearing you say is you got to know what you can do. You got to know about your psychological fortitude, and you've got to know what this achievement is going to take out of you in order to get that 10 times better feeling, or the grade, or the acceptance into school, or residency, or whatever it is you're striving for. And some of those things you're going to have to say, this is not good for me.
Right. And it won't feel good to make the decision. Like these are really hard decisions, especially when you've told yourself, oh, I need to do X in order for my family to be proud of me. Or I need to do Y for me to be proud of myself. Right. And so sometimes just saying, you know what, I just can't. And, one of the stories that I share in the book, I was promoted to full professor. I lose track of time 2 years ago, last year, I don't know, I lose track of all the time. But in my mind, I had to go through the ranks in order to achieve full professor. I wasn't going to stop at being an associate professor with tenure, which is an accomplishment. It's an accomplishment as a Black woman in the US. And I was literally making myself ill, physically sick, trying to push to get grants and do all the things that I needed to do in order to achieve this full status that someone said, well, the only way you can get there is if you get a multi-million-dollar grant. There's not a lot of multi-million-dollar grants going around to study issues for Black people. That's just the reality. And at the point when I said, I actually hurt myself and needed back surgery, I said, you know what? I might need to let this go. I might need to let go of being full professor. And the next thought was relief. Like I felt relieved, like I don't have to do that. It wasn't an easy decision, but in my body, I felt better with that instant decision. Not, my initial thought was panic, like, no, but after I got over the panic, I thought, right, this is okay. But this is the thing. I did get promoted because I found another way. And
Mhm.
sometimes we have to figure out just what makes sense for you as an individual person, pursue the thing that makes sense, even if it's not the original path, and then opportunities will begin to open up that do in fact make sense, allow you to tap into your authenticity and maintain your PF at a level that you feel like you're not losing your mind on most days.
Yes, and that's not failure. Actually, that's success
It is success.
when you find the right way to do it for you. And sometimes that means not doing it at all. You know, it's 5:56. We've got just a few more minutes. Can you take a couple of more, Rita?
Yes, yes, yes,
Oh,
yes.
good. Okay, how do you integrate a person's spirituality in the therapy room? This is by Stephen.
Oh my goodness.
Spirituality in the therapy room.
That's actually one of my favorite things to talk about because I do know that a lot of folks in training um, aren't necessarily spiritual and religious people. And I think there was some research that was done looking explicitly at clinical psychologists and found that we don't tend to be an overly spiritual group of individuals. At the same time, if you're working with someone who's Hispanic or who's Black or Nigerian American, you know, it's important to be able to talk about spirituality. And I tell my supervisees, you don't have to freak out or panic that someone's going to ask you about your religion. You need to be ready to answer the question and not freak out. But you have to be able to incorporate the things that are important to that person in their therapy. They can't check being Black at the door. They can't check reading the Bible at the door. So ask them about, you know, what does spirituality mean for you in your life? Because it means different things to different people. You know, what does it mean in your life? And then figure out ways, collaborate. That's what we're supposed to do in therapy. You know, collaborate with that individual to be able to integrate who they are.
Yes. And you don't have to know everything. What you need to know is how to ask people and give them permission to be the experts in that situation.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes. Yes. Well, okay, let me try one more. What should the federal government, the state governments, and local governments be doing to help disenfranchised populations access the services they need? Oh boy, that's by John.
John, what's your major? Like, what do you
That's a big question.
you lobbying? You working for Congress? What are you up
Yeah,
to?
well, I guess all of that, huh?
No, it is a big question because we need change at so many different levels. You know, I think about just ideas of reparations. It's come up a little bit more often. And I think one of the reasons that there are challenges, there are Black people who say, you know, well, I don't want reparations because I don't want a handout. Well, you know, last I checked, we never got those 40 acres or the mule. And so when we think about trying to level the playing field, I really do believe that we need to be able to talk financially, finding ways that we can get better education. Right now, you know, in certain parts of the US, Black children are undereducated.
Right.
So we need to at least get education to a better level. We need to at least have teachers trained so that they can recommend or refer children who can be evaluated for gifted programs. Like we need a lot more, you know, leveling of the playing field that simply does not exist. And that is something that can start at the federal, state, and even local levels of government.
Right, right. I've enjoyed talking with you so much. I want you to know there's 43 more questions that I couldn't even ask you. So obviously this has been a rich hour to spend with you, Rita. Thank you so much for everything you shared.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
So much. I hate to interrupt this enlightening conversation. We could go on and on, but our time has run out. I want to thank you so much, Dr. Walker and Dr. Wyatt, for openly sharing your inspiring personal stories, your knowledge, expertise, to raise our awareness of the Black mental health issues facing us today and what changes we need to have happen to erase the years of stigma. We hope you will all join us on Monday, January 11th for The Beauty of What Remains with Rabbi Steve Leader and Dr. David Rubin. Until then, we wish you and your family happy and healthy holidays. Stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you in 2021.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you so much, Dr. Walker. Please come again.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I thought it was a great conversation.
It really was.